The Spartans produced the most well-documented physically elite soldiers in recorded history, bodies that modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains describes as structurally superior to contemporary professional athletes. They trained for decades without a single piece of iron equipment. What they used instead hit 6 specific hormonal and mechanical systems in the human body. Systems that explain, with precision, why the results looked the way they did. The single largest voluntary testosterone spike a human body can produce through movement happens in fewer than 12 seconds and requires nothing but a slope of 15 degrees or more. Uphill sprint. On flat ground, the posterior chain, glutes, hamstrings, soleus, contributes to propulsion, but is never forced into full contraction because the stride geometry allows compensation from the quadriceps. The moment the grade reaches 15 degrees, the hip extension demand increases by approximately 60%, and the quadriceps can no longer compensate. Every stride must be completed by the glutes and hamstrings firing to full motor unit recruitment. That full recruitment, held across 8 to 12 seconds of maximal effort, triggers a testosterone and growth hormone release that flat sprinting produces at roughly 1/3 the magnitude. The form cue the Spartans built into the Krypteia, their youth survival program, was forward lean. The torso must stay at roughly 45 degrees to the slope, not upright, or the hip extension shortens and the glutes lose the peak contraction. 3 to 6 repetitions, with 2 minutes of recovery between each, keeps the nervous system in the high output hormonal window without crossing into the cortisol range, where the response inverts. That hormonal window remains open for 48 hours. The next movement is the one the Spartans used to detonate it immediately. One movement in the ancient Greek pentathlon produces a greater peak glute contraction than any weighted squat ever measured in laboratory conditions, and it requires no load whatsoever. Broad jump. The broad jump, called halma in the ancient games, is not a power exercise in the way most people understand power. It is a coordination movement between the hip flexors and the glutes that the body almost never executes correctly without deliberate training. At the moment of takeoff, the hip flexors must reach full lengthening while the glutes fire at their maximum rate. A simultaneous loading of opposing muscle groups that creates what physiologists call a myotatic stretch shortening cycle. This cycle produces peak force output measurably higher than a loaded squat because no external weight can match the speed at which the body's own stored elastic energy releases. The form cue is the arm swing. Both arms drive back behind the hips at the crouch and forward aggressively at launch, which rotates the pelvis into posterior tilt and increases the glute's effective range of motion by roughly 30 degrees. 5 sets of 3 jumps with full recovery between sets builds the reactive strength that makes every subsequent explosive movement in training more efficient. The broad jump teaches the glutes to fire fast. What the next exercise exposes is the one structure attached to the rib cage that every physique with visible structural depth has, and that flat pressing never loads. Most people develop pressing strength for years and still produce no visible development along the rib cage because they are missing a single angle, an angle that does not exist in any flat pressing movement. Pike push-up. The standard push-up runs its line of force roughly horizontal, which loads the pectoralis major and anterior deltoid, but physically cannot load the serratus anterior because the floor blocks the scapula from completing its full range of protraction. The serratus anterior is the muscle that creates the finger-like serrations visible along the lateral rib cage in ancient Greek athletic sculpture, and in every physique that looks structurally different from the side rather than just the front. It cannot be loaded through flat pressing because the surface it rests on eliminates the motion that activates it. Elevating the hips above the shoulder line shifts the angle of force to approximately 60 degrees of forward flexion, placing direct load on the serratus anterior and the upper anterior deltoid simultaneously. The form cue is non-negotiable. Hips must be clearly above the shoulder line at setup, not level, not slightly raised, because even a 5 centimeter drop transfers the load back to the pectoralis and the mechanism disappears entirely. 4 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions with a 3-second eccentric produces approximately 42% greater serratus anterior activation than a flat push-up at equal perceived exertion. The upper body is now structurally loaded from the front. The next movement resets the entire hormonal environment from the outside, and the Spartans used it for this function specifically. Sustained immersion in water below 20 degrees Celsius triggers a norepinephrine release of 300 to 400% above baseline, a response that takes 20 to 30 minutes of cardiovascular training to produce on land and happens here in under 90 seconds. Cold water swimming. The Spartans trained in the Eurotas River, which runs at 14 to 18 degrees Celsius depending on season. The cold immersion alone drives a norepinephrine spike that suppresses inflammatory markers and elevates dopamine receptor sensitivity for hours after the session ends. But the swimming itself adds a second physiological layer the cold alone cannot: full body isometric tension held through dynamic movement. To maintain position in moving water, every stabilizing structure, the deep spinal erectors, the transverse abdominis, the rotator cuff, must contract continuously while the primary movers generate propulsion. This combination of sustained stabilizer loading and dynamic prime mover firing is the structural reason swimmer physiques develop differently from gym physiques. The tension profile reaches muscles that isolation training cannot target by design. The form cue is the breathing pattern. Exhaling fully underwater and inhaling at the surface turn forces the diaphragm through its full range of motion, which trains intra-abdominal pressure regulation, the same mechanism that stabilizes the spine under heavy load on land. 30 minutes of cold water swimming produces a cortisol reduction that persists for up to 6 hours. The nervous system is recovered. The hormonal environment is primed. What comes next is the movement that loads the entire posterior chain under the one demand that swimming cannot create: prolonged mechanical tension under carried weight. The single most effective method ever documented for increasing VO2 max, the hard ceiling of aerobic capacity, is not running. It is carrying weight slowly for a long time, and the mechanism operates through a mitochondrial pathway that running bypasses entirely: loaded march. The Krypteia sent Spartan boys alone into the wilderness for months carrying their own equipment, a typical load of 15 to 25 kilograms across 20 to 40 kilometers per day. At that load and pace, the cardiovascular demand holds at roughly 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate, precisely the zone where mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new mitochondria inside muscle cells, is maximized. Running at higher intensities produces less mitochondrial density because the nervous system cannot sustain the output long enough to force the adaptation. The loaded march holds the exact zone for the exact duration. Simultaneously, the load forces the hip flexors, the gluteus medius, and the tibialis anterior into sustained eccentric loading with every step, the three structures most responsible for gait efficiency and lateral knee stability, because each footfall with weight must be actively decelerated. The form cue is load placement. The weight must sit high on the back, not low, because high placement keeps the center of gravity over the hips and prevents the anterior pelvic tilt that transfers the mechanical demand away from the glutes and into the lumbar spine. 3 sessions per week of 45 to 60 minutes with 15 kilograms produces measurable increases in mitochondrial density within 4 weeks. The body can now sustain output longer than it could before. The last movement uses that capacity to produce the one structural adaptation that determines how the physique reads when it is completely relaxed. The single position that simultaneously produces scapular depression, full thoracic extension, and gluteal compression, the 3 postural signatures visible in every ancient Greek sculpture of an athlete, is not a stretch and is not a lift. It is a held inversion. And the nervous system treats it as a threat for approximately 8 weeks before it stops resisting it. Handstand hold against a wall. Inverting the body places the trapezius, serratus anterior, and rotator cuff under a body weight load, 60 to 80 kilograms for most adults, from a position they encounter nowhere in upright life. The blood pressure inversion increases cerebral circulation, which elevates neural drive to the shoulder stabilizers at a rate that upright overhead pressing cannot replicate. The glutes must contract maximally throughout the hold to prevent lumbar hyperextension, which is the structural reason handstand-trained athletes develop gluteal density that is visibly different from those who train only hip hinge patterns. The scapulae are forced into full depression and posterior tilt, which is the direct mechanical opposite of the forward rounded position that desk posture and horizontal pressing both produce over years of accumulation. One form cue, the lower back, must remain flat throughout the hold, not arched, which requires the glutes and abdominals to co-contract simultaneously, creating the deep core tension that protects the lumbar spine and ingrains the pattern under real load. Work to 3 sets of 20 to 30 seconds of controlled hold with 60 seconds of rest to reach the neuromuscular adaptation threshold without exceeding the tolerance of wrist flexors that have not yet been prepared for the demand. Every movement on this list is a complete mechanical system. A specific angle, a specific load, a specific duration, targeting a specific hormonal or structural threshold. The Spartans did not know the names of the muscles they were training. They knew the results. The skeletons did not lie.